Good afternoon. Thanks for having us. I'm Tom Mendoza, deal partner at Eqt Ventures. We're a $500 million European multi-stage VC. Building technology startups is very difficult, and it requires more than cash. So as well as having a large fund, we have a fully serviced team of operating partners that come from the likes of Spotify, King, and Booking.com that support the entrepreneurs we invest in their journey. But let me introduce you now to Joe Root, founder of Permutive, one of the best kept secrets in the European ecosystem. And yet, Permutive's edge computing platform is now running on over 1 billion devices per month, which is an incredible number and feat, Joe. So just to kick things off, why don't you tell us a little bit about the journey of Permutive up until this point and how you guys got to 1 billion devices?
Yeah, of course. So, hey, I'm Joe, one of the co-founders of Permutive. We're a decentralized customer data platform, and that's how we kind of got started in the world. So customer data platforms serve a pretty simple purpose. It's to collect all that user data which is being generated on sites, in apps, by devices, to centralize that data and then to process that data. And typically, when you build a customer data platform, you run and build that in the cloud. And what Permutive does, which is very different to the rest of the landscape, is rather than putting the customer data platform in the cloud, we put the customer data platform in the user's devices. And the reason why and how we kind of got started in this is initially we set out with this vision to build a personalization layer for the web. And as we started to build this, we ran into some pretty big problems. And these problems were problems which were created in the cloud, but we realized we needed to overcome them. So in order to build personalization, you need to be able to process data really fast. Typically, you've got a couple of milliseconds to do it. You typically want to process as much data as you possibly can, so unlimited data if possible. And you need to do it in a privacy-compliant way, because now, actually, if you look at the largest companies in the world, actually privacy is the most important thing. You look at Apple's most recent conference, and actually all their conversations around how do you process user data, not on the cloud, but on the user's device. So we got started by building kind of this personalization layer, but very quickly we ran into the problems which were being created by the cloud. So we realized that in order to build the platform we wanted, we were going to have to rebuild data infrastructure and architecture, not for the cloud, but to run on the edge, run on those users' devices. And that's what we set out to do, and we kind of built. And about 2 years ago, we found very, very strong traction in a couple of very specific problems, but those then led to very rapid growth, initially within the publishing industry, which now means we sit on 1 billion devices.
Awesome. And a lot has been written about edge computing. Explain to us why we should be making this transition from the cloud towards the edge, and how does this impact overall data processing?
Yeah, of course. So I suppose the fundamental thesis behind Permutive, but also what we believe is a truth in the world, is that over the next 10 years, we'll go from around 15 billion devices in the world to 1 trillion devices in the world. And those devices will generate enormous volumes of data, and the applications and software which is built on top of that data will generate trillions of dollars in value. But right now, actually, the way in which we're set up to process data, which is in the cloud, doesn't enable us to realize that future vision. And there are a couple of problems which arise with cloud computing when you're talking about the scale of data which we're about to enter into. And internally at the company, we're really passionate about this stuff. We refer to these as the pillars of the edge. So fundamentally, like, the cloud has a number of problems. The first problem is speed. So the latency of the network requests and transferring data between the edge devices in the cloud. The second piece is accuracy. So bandwidth limits the amount of data you can get into the cloud. So often you're only training models on 1–2% of the data actually generated. Number 3 is privacy, is the fact that actually, if this is user data, having this centralized presents real privacy risks. Number 4 is cost. It is enormously expensive to process the volume of data being created right now, which means we discard and we do it slower. And then number 5 is resilience, is you don't want these things to go down, but actually the cloud is this central point of failure. So edge computing, we believe, is important for that world, but also in the here and now, we've gone from 500 million to 15 billion devices, and actually those problems exist today as well. So at its core, we believe edge computing will make possible trillions of dollars in value, but we also believe that in the here and now, it should make possible billions of dollars in value in the world. And that is kind of what we set out to do. And I suppose the top level problem which we solve is right now the majority of the world's data is produced on devices, but it's processed in the cloud. So rather than moving the data to the processing, we move the processing to the data, and we unlock value in the here and now as well.
And so far
Oh.
So far, you've been focusing on the publisher segment, and you've landed clients like BuzzFeed, Condé Nast, and Business Insider. Can you talk a little bit about the value you're delivering and the ROI these clients are seeing with the Permutive platform?
Yeah. So I suppose to the point earlier, we believe kind of in the here and now, billions of dollars of value should be created by ability to process data on the edge. So the first vertical which we ended up focusing on was this vertical, broadly speaking, of ad tech or ad technology. And we arrived in it via this very long-winded route of working with a number of publishers. But what we found was an industry which is $120 billion a year, entirely powered by data, but smashed to pieces by privacy. And there have been a number of macro kind of changes in the world which have led to this. One, the largest company in the world, Apple, decided that it no longer believed that ad tech was privacy compliant, so it started to break the fundamental technology which underpinned it. And number two, we saw government regulation emerge in the form of GDPR and now CCPA. So you end up with this ecosystem which is $120 billion, entirely driven by data processing, but that data processing no longer works for over half of that industry. So when we heard about this problem, it sounded kind of interesting to us, and we started to speak to publishers about it. And what we realized is, in this industry, it is the publisher's data which powers the entirety of ad tech. But right now, actually, publishers are aggregated and third-party data providers pull this data together, but that was stopping, that was starting to no longer work. So publishers found themselves in this position where actually they were able to fix this industry, they had the data, but they didn't have the tools to do it. So we started by saying to our publishers, hey, the way in which you make money is if you can process data and attach it to an ad, effectively you get paid for that. But right now it only works 10% of the time. And it only works 10% of the time because the cloud is too slow and it's privacy incompliant, so it's blocked by things like Apple. So if we can fix those problems, we can turn 10% into 100% and we can generate real world value for you. So we did that. We turned 10% into 100% by moving all this data processing onto the user's device. And overnight, we just started to generate our publishers a load of money which previously they were unable to make. So now Permutive's publishers have generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, which didn't exist before they started working with Permutive. And the way in which we've done that is by moving the data processing onto that user's device. So when you take customers like BuzzFeed, Condé Nast, they will move off existing cloud providers like Salesforce and Oracle and Adobe, and pretty much instantly they will see a revenue uplift of somewhere between 2x and 10x. And that's pretty transformational for these businesses and generates a ton of value, and is why we've been able to take this market very, very quickly.
Exciting. And tell us a little bit about where you think edge computing is going beyond publishing and the impacts the edge will have in, say, transportation, healthcare, manufacturing, and where you see the space going in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we think that we're about to go through an enormous period of disruption in pretty much every major vertical. So device growth and the data it produces allows us to build new applications and software which previously didn't exist. And to your point, that will impact a whole range of verticals. If you take healthcare as a really simple example, if your watch is trying to figure out if you're having a heart attack, right now we have the capability to do that in the sense that the sensors are collecting heart rate data, but actually the cloud prevents us from making that world possible. And it does so for a couple of reasons, right? If your watch is taking a reading of your heart rate every couple of milliseconds, the first problem you're going to run into is it's too much data to transfer into the cloud. So all of a sudden you're running on 1% of data and this model of your heart rate is inaccurate. Then problem number two you're going to run into is speed. All of a sudden you have to rely on network latency and your ability to process this data in the cloud, but actually you don't want to wait to figure out if you're having a heart attack or not. Then third, it comes down to resilience. If your watch goes offline, you don't want that to stop processing your data and stop working. Four is privacy. Do you want like all of this data to go into the cloud and eventually be sold onto an insurance company or somewhere else? And then number five comes down to cost. It is just too expensive to run that infrastructure. So even in that simple example, the only way to come around those challenges is actually to move the data processing onto the device. But we think it's much bigger than just like advertising or even figuring out if you're having a heart attack, right? It is everything from your watch knowing you're having a heart attack all the way through to smart cities and smart factories. And we think fundamentally edge computing is this knife edge of this pendulum swing we go through in technology between centralization and decentralization. But we think that the end result of it will be a pretty amazing world.
Thanks so much for that, Joe. That's been great.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.